Rod Young. I'm the moderator of this panel. And I've been told by the panel that my main job is to stop each of them from talking too long, and I'll try to do that. I just want to say a couple of things in the way of introducing. The topic is creating coalition, and I would add the phrase, then, Vietnam War years, and now. And the prospect there, or the hope there, is that some of the things we experienced, learned, both successes and not successes, about creating coalition then will help us in creating coalition now, or might help us. Coalition, to me, is a situation that we find and help to materialize where different constituencies, different groups of people, different organizations have enough overlapping, though not identical, and sometimes even competing interests, that they decide that there is a worthy enough goal that they're going to work together. They're going to form a cooperative effort to work on that issue. And in addition to a goal that they agree, or goals that they agree on, they also probably need to agree on some sort of methods of action. The simplest one, the one that gathered the most people in a public way during the Vietnam War, obviously, were the mass marches. And I think one of the reasons I'm on this panel is I was the coordinator of the March on Washington in November '69. And in May 1970, I'll just say one word about May 1970. It was a time of tremendous public anger at the invasion of Cambodia. And it was the first time that the Mobilization Coalition decided to incorporate nonviolent civil disobedience into the march. But by the time we got to Saturday, after the Kent State killings and the government's decision to allow us to have a rally on the ellipse right next to the White House, which we frankly didn't expect them to do, the idea of nonviolent civil disobedience disappeared or was reduced to David Dellinger leading a few hundred people out of the 100,000 who came into an intersection in D.C. I only say that because I think one of the challenges in coalition is not just what's the goal and how do we bring people together who have only overlapping, not identical interests. Another challenge is what are we prepared to do together, and what is the preparation that's involved in that. We have a panel of four people representing is not the right word, four people who have been deeply involved in four different constituencies that certainly were important during the Vietnam era and during the Vietnam era anti-war movement. We also obviously are missing something. We don't have a representative of students, we don't have a representative of vets, and we don't have a representative of the business community, which is not one that we easily remember being involved, but they were, and they put up money, they ran ads, and they were involved in their own political circles in helping to oppose the war. Let me just introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. Vivian Rothstein, to my left, was part of the Bratislava Conference in 1967, where American anti-war activists went to Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, and met with Vietnamese from the north and from the National Liberation Front. She was not only a participant, but helped to organize the Jeanette Rankin Brigade, which you may remember was mentioned in last night's program. And that was the first national anti-war, women's anti-war demonstration. She has worked for the last number of years for the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, working to lift standards for low-wage workers in Southern California. Reverend, and I'm giving the order in which people are going to speak. Reverend Richard Fernandez was the first executive director of the Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam, which this church certainly knows because it was at this church where that organization had its national gathering. Dick was also centrally involved, as was Cal Cav, in hosting Martin Luther King when he gave his famous anti-Vietnam War speech, public speech, at Riverside Church. Dick also coordinated an effort by Cal Cav to publish a book on war crimes in the Name of America, a study of war crimes committed by U.S. troops. something that Seymour Melman, a name that some of you will recognize, was also very much involved in. Gerald Horne, former executive director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, has published more than 30 books, teaches, most recently, The Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow. But Gerald, you've got a new book about the American Revolution. What's the title of it? I don't think it's on my little...
The Counter-Revolution of 1776.
Okay.
Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Actually, I'm alluding to it in my remarks.
I'm not surprised. I mean, okay. So, but it's fascinating. And I heard one of the organizers of this conference who was reading the book on a conference call, he said, "Boy, this is a fascinating book, and you'll hear more about it." And then Bob Muhlenkamp, organized labor is his area. And I don't want to say represents because, who represents people of color or women? I mean, but involved in that community in a major way. Bob was executive vice president of 1199, and we had this wonderful conversation where he said, the labor movement was hardly involved in the anti-war activities. I said, my God, I would sit in these meetings and somebody said 1199 or District 37 of asked me, right. And I thought, oh, that's really good. So it depends where you sit, how you see the importance or not so important of something that's happened. Post-Vietnam, Bob played a key role in the organization of Labor Against War, which obviously didn't even have a specific one in there, although it was organized in response to the invasion of Iraq. So and he was in 2004, because of that involvement on the anti-Iraq invasion labor movement group, he was one of the senior advisors to Howard Dean's campaign, particularly because of that involvement. So that's us, and obviously this is you, and the reason that each person is only going to speak 8 minutes is so you have a chance to engage in the way you want to. Vivian?
Okay. Well, one of the most remarkable things about the movement against the war in Vietnam was the amount of contact that peace activists here had with Vietnamese. There were over 200 Americans who went to North Vietnam during the bombing to witness the bombing and to see the impact of American policy on the Vietnamese. I had a chance to do that in 1967, and there were hundreds of more Americans who had a chance to meet with the Vietnamese in Canada, in Cuba, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. And it was an incredible strategy that the Vietnamese had to develop a line of communication with Americans, to equip us with information that we otherwise couldn't have, and to build real bonds of responsibility that we felt about the Vietnamese and towards their country. In many of the meetings, the Vietnamese mentioned, and in my experience, they talked about it quite a bit, about the importance of American women as organizers in the anti-war movement. They felt that women had a certain credibility and a trustability and an ability to understand the travesty of the war on families, both their own families and families in Vietnam. And in fact, one of the very first meetings that the Vietnamese had with Americans was in Jakarta in 1965 with representatives of Women's Strike for Peace, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and younger women from SDS and student movements. So this was a very important consciousness-raising experience for women, American women, who met with the Vietnamese or went to Hanoi. In delegations, they always insisted that there be women represented, and actually, I don't think I would have been invited if they hadn't insisted that there be women on our delegation. So, and then once in Vietnam, they introduced us to the Women's Union, the Vietnamese Women's Union, which provided services to women, but also developed women's leadership and saw women as really a political force. So that was a very important message that we got from the Vietnamese. Another important message was, and I'll quote exactly what they said. They said, "You peace activists are the true sons and daughters of Washington and Jefferson." And that we needed to see ourselves as carrying on a proud democratic American tradition. They also said that they were at war with the American government and not the American people. And that if the American people had the true facts about what was going on in Vietnam, they would oppose the war. So these two bits of advice were difficult for us. We were young revolutionaries. We didn't trust our government. We were very questioning about the whole concept of patriotism. And the American people, well, we had a certain arrogance. We weren't sure that we thought that the American people would ever come around to the right point of view. But these messages, I think, helped us to be good coalition builders. And the messages I have taken through the rest of my political life, reaching out to the broadest range of people to get them engaged, not insisting on agreement on every single political position, having one goal, as Ron said, agreeing on one goal in a coalition, having mutual respect and trust of each other, sharing the work and sharing the credit, having a message. These are all with the goal of building a majoritarian movement. So I feel like the Vietnamese not only gave us information, but they gave us political guidance. And I think a lot of people who had contact with the Vietnamese had that whole concept, that whole approach to coalition building. The backbone of the student movement, certainly in the religious communities, and in communities in general. Women were on the demonstrations, were extremely activated. Women's Strike for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom were the early pioneers, and then students came out of the civil rights movement and the student movement. But there was really very little place for women's leadership in anti-war coalitions, and there was an enormous amount of frustration that women had in trying to even have women speakers or women participate in strategy development. And I'll give you an example just in the anti-draft movement. There were hundreds and hundreds of women involved in the anti-draft movement. Women's Strike for Peace had a whole campaign, not my son, not your son, not their son. They had lots of draft counseling. Yet the draft movement was, the decisions were all made by men. And the actors were men. And the women were in the support situation. And there was even a slogan that was used, gals say yes to boys who say no, which...
With Joan Baez as a person.
Yeah.
A big poster.
And it really such a demeaning slogan for a movement that women were so deeply involved in. So over time, and as the consciousness of women developed, more and more experienced women decided to build their own independent women's organizations, women's liberation organizations, and to do their political work in those organizations. And that was true for me. I helped to build the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, which was modeled somewhat on the Vietnamese Women's Union, still intending to do anti-war work because there are a lot of women's liberation folks who are very devoted, but trying to do it in a women's context. And just to, Ron mentioned the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. There was also another big effort that women made in meetings with the Vietnamese in Toronto and Vancouver, where hundreds of women met with a delegation of Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese. These efforts were rife with strife between the feminine position, the more maternal position, and the feminist position. So in each one of these, there was a real difficulty in coming up with this trust and with this common message. Just in closing, I want to say that after the Vietnam War and the difficulties and the successes of the anti-war movement, women went on to play very important leadership roles in subsequent movements, particularly in the anti-nuclear testing movement, in the WTO protests, and more recently in Occupy. And women brought new democratic forms of decision-making and engagement and involvement, which I think came out of understanding that everybody has to have a voice. It's a messy process, but it's a way to engage people and not leave people feeling completely ignored and unheard. So there's been a lot of progress made, but there was a lot of pain also that was experienced during the anti-war movement.
Thank you,
Okay.
I'd like to begin just with my own little Vietnam story. One of the most interesting discussions we had in North Vietnam was with one of our hosts said to us, Why is it at your demonstrations that many people run around with the flag of the National Liberation Front? You have a revolutionary flag. Why don't you wave that flag? That's your flag. It's a revolutionary flag. Ever since that time, when I'm a Protestant minister, and in my tradition, people want to call you a progressive Christian, I don't do that. I'm not going to give away Christianity to the rest of the people. I happen to be just a normal Christian, like my fundamentalist right-wing friends. You know, I realize I get painted with that brush too, but maybe they'll get painted with mine. You never know. But it was really fascinating why you waved our flag at your demonstration. You know, they just didn't get it. If you dare to go to a school of social work, which I never have, and you want to learn about coalitions, they have books. And there are 6 to 10 steps on building a coalition. And I'm not going to go through it. But if you're interested, you should go get one of those books. I mention this because the coalitions I was a part of during the Vietnam War were nothing like what those eight points said. And there was no order. In fact, our order was commonly disorder. We did things backwards. We did things out of place. We did a lot of silly things in organizing. But we never set a goal, created objectives, did a budget. A budget was how much money can you raise, how fast. I don't remember budgets. Did we have budgets? We just kept spending money and praying that someone would raise it. And as has been said all the way through the conference, they were always messy. Not only were there women's issues, every sectarian group in the country seemed to want to join the mobilizations. And every time you came together, the same people would give the same speeches. Now, I'm the kind of person that if you come to my mobilization meeting that I'm in the first time and you have a sermon, I think it's great, get it out. But in the 7th coming together and you're still giving that same sermon each time we get together, it's a little old. And people did that all the time. We go to Cleveland for a big mobilization planning meeting, and Barbara Bick from Women's Strike for Peace and we had the Trotskyites there, and they packed the building, they packed the meeting. Then they wanted to know if they could all vote. And so Barbara and I were told at 6 o'clock the next morning, a Sunday morning it was, we should meet with these 60 people to decide whether they can be in the meeting, whether they can vote. I mean, what did we know? Could they vote? Could they be in the meeting? But the meeting was so loud and noisy, the Protestant minister on Sunday morning said, "God damn it, will you shut up?" And boy, did it get quiet. I never said anything like that in any meeting. I was so frustrated with this. Anyway, it was messy. But what kept us on track, no surprise, is that our issue was on the front page and on television every day and night. We were getting a leader killed, we were getting a candidate killed, as a way of focusing you after all your messy discussions, as a way to keeping you tuned up. And rare was the time that a messy discussion ended up with people walking out of the room and not coming back. Regrettably, some of them should have walked out so we didn't have to stay there until 2 in the morning. But people stayed, and we ended our meetings usually with everybody in the room. My problem in talking about these large demonstrations is people think that was the anti-war movement, the 10, 15, 20 big demonstrations, whether in LA or New York or Chicago or Washington. And I'm a local person, and I don't think that's where the movement got grown. That was a result. Those happenings were a result of what happened in our towns and cities across America. Every day in the week, 52 weeks a year, rain and sun and snow. All kinds of people doing things that were quite amazing and abnormal. Someone walked into my office in the summer of '68. His name was Charles Hubble from the Santa Barbara Yearly Meeting. And if you're not a Quaker, you don't know what it means when he says, "I had a minute from the Quaker meeting, from the what do you call the quarterly meeting? From the quarterly meeting, I have a minute." Well, if you're Catholic, you know what an encyclical letter is? Well, this is an encyclical for a Quaker. I was smart enough to say, "Oh, yes, let's get together." So this guy comes in his pants and nice shirt, and he says, "I teach sociology at Santa Barbara." And a few of us were talking, and we thought it might be interesting if we had quiet 1-hour demonstrations in front of post offices. And this summer, I was trying to see if I could do that, get some going. Do you have a contact list? I'm looking at this guy. You must be kidding. 1 hour in front of a post office. So I handed him my contact list of 400 clergy across the country, like in 5 months in hundreds of towns and cities across America for the rest of the war, in front of the post office, 1 hour a day. We're Quakers and their friends with signs protesting the war. So my first lesson in all coalition work is, you better learn how to listen. You better learn how to listen. Because when things are going bad and people are upset and they have a little rage, they actually think of a lot of interesting, creative ideas that you never heard of. Thank you. You never heard of. I had that experience so many times, it was embarrassing. But I learned to shut up pretty quick. Just listen, Dick. And at the end, something good might happen. I don't want to continue to talk about the large coalitions. My work was primarily in the religious community, and a few of you were in a morning meeting where we were talking about religious coalitions. So if you've heard this once, bear with me. My work was, I was at the University of Pennsylvania in a campus ministry outfit, and in the spring of 1966, our board of directors made one person on the board the president, vice president, and treasurer of the board as a way to control the staff. And 7 of the clergy staffs just stood up and resigned. We hadn't even talked about it. I just had our first son. We just all resigned. And then I called my friend up at Yale, Bill Coffin, and said, I need a job. And 2 weeks later, he came back. And he basically said, if you want a job for which you will never have to worry about getting a job in a local church for the rest of your life, I might have one for you. So I went to New York and got interviewed by the people whose books I used to read. Rabbi Abraham Heschel, Daniel Berrigan, Robert McAfee Brown. It was kind of a who's who of liberal churchmen around the country. And they hired me. They gave me an office with no windows at the National Council of Churches, a desk, a part-time secretary, and 420 3x5 cards with names, addresses, and phone numbers of clergy they had been in touch with in December at the time of a bombing pause, and said, we've got to get these clergy, that's how we were called clergy concerned to begin with, to continue doing stuff. So that was my charge. And I had asked someone else, they asked me what I wanted for pay, and I hadn't even thought about it. But I said, what I really want is a blank check to travel. Because my view of the world was, if it's not going to happen in your hometown, it really isn't happening anyplace. And so within 2 months, I had arranged a 17-day trip up the West Coast and across Colorado. 17 days, 17 cities, with a clergy meeting in every city. And when I got through, I had 14 groups. Then I repeated that a couple of more times during the year. And then just like the civil rights movement, where if you broke the color ban in one town and another town will do it before you got there, they didn't want the trouble. So we had clergy groups beginning to form, all over the country, just because we got a few going. So our work was really creating 78 clergy and laity groups across the country who were every day doing all kinds of things to stop the war. And I always say that our big demonstrations, particularly those involving civil disobedience, kind of rattled people, woke them up. And groups like Clergy and Laity Concerned kept them awake and active at a local level. Nobody ever came to a national demonstration that I was in who said, gee, I got up this morning and thought I'd come to this. I've never been involved before. All these people have been involved locally all the time. So that's all.
Thanks, Dick. Thank you very much. As you can see, I'm going to read from my remarks because I have a lot to say and not that much time in which to say it. But I'm going to begin with what I'm ending with, which is that I'm going to make a proposal that the peace movement, the labor movement, the progressive movement, consider holding an annual meeting that coincides with the convening of the United Nations General Assembly in the fall of this year and every year, where heads of states and heads of government convene in New York, and that we hold a simultaneous meeting of the peace movement from member states of the United Nations. And one of the reasons I say that is because my own feeling is that I'm not sure if at this historical conjuncture that the U.S. left and U.S. progressive movement can really meet its historic responsibilities to stop the war machine. And I think we need help from the international community, which is one of the reasons why I'm making this proposal. And I think we need a basic understanding of why it is that more than people in most countries, we have such a need for an anti-war movement and have a need to discuss why we need coalitions to build an anti-war movement. I mean, many people in many countries, that's not their major concern, that their government will attack another country. But that's obviously a preoccupation of ours, and we need to think more deeply about this. So my first point will be trying to reconfigure why it is that we're in this predicament. The second point will be a discussion of why the war in Vietnam was probably the biggest fiasco in the history of U.S. foreign policy, of which there have been quite a few, not least Iraq 2003, the Afghanistan intervention by Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s, and then the third being this proposal for a meeting that would take place annually. Now, the weakness of the U.S. left and inability to restrain U.S. warmongers flows in part from a misunderstanding of the nature of U.S. society and history. This misunderstanding also helps to explain why it is that despite a proliferation of police killings of late, there has been little discussion not only of the stigmatizing of black people, particularly during the era of slavery and Jim Crow, the two epochs which comprise the bulk of this nation's history, but also the fact that during the 1776 War of Secession, blacks stood overwhelmingly with London, which had moved further down the path of abolition, and this stand led to a culture of stigmatizing and bludgeoning of blacks baked into the cake of U.S. society and history after the settlers prevailed. The miscomprehension of the U.S. left of this fundamental historical reality has become so dire that the miniseries that played on the cable channel Black Entertainment Television of the black billionaire Robert Johnson, I'm speaking of the Book of Negroes, was more insightful on the founding of this nation than generations of writings by progressive historians and even radical U.S. historians. Likewise, the dispossession of the indigenous of North America, along with those of Mexican origin, flowed inexorably into the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1890s and the implantation of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines and the atomic bombing of Japan and the genocidal wars in Korea and Vietnam. Foreign policy flows inevitably from domestic policy and the militarized identity politics of the construction of whiteness, which undergirded both enslavement and dispossession, inexorably manifested itself in Indochina. The proclivity of the U.S. left to view the founding of the United States as a so-called great leap forward for humanity or even an incomplete bourgeois democratic revolution has hampered its ability to tackle police killings at home and war abroad. This proclivity has persisted despite the best efforts of historians such as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Walter Hickson, and many others. The fundamental misunderstanding of U.S. history and society is compounded by the fact that many in our movement refuse to make an analysis of the correlation of forces, global forces, class forces, race forces, as a precursor to developing strategy and tactics. There seems to be the idea that one only has to develop the so-called correct line and presume, for example, that the Euro-American working class and middle class will co-sign when we know that the percentage of this group voting for the right rises every 4 years. The overthrow of British rule in 1776 did represent a step forward from the religious wars of Europe, Protestant versus Catholic, then Christians versus Muslims and the Jewish. But this axis was replaced by a racial axis, a militarized identity politics of a new type, whereby those who could be defined as, quote, white, unquote, mostly from Europe, but even from Lebanon, were then, of course, allowed citizenship in order to overawe militant African and indigenous communities. There has been a connection between enslavement and dispossession at home and imperialism abroad, and that one of the largest uncompensated expropriations of private property to this point occurred in 1865 when billions of dollars in human property, that is to say slave property, was taken without compensation, which not only embittered many defined as, quote, white, unquote, to this very day, but as well the fear of expropriation of private property via socialism not only drove counter-revolutionary interventions in Indochina, but worldwide, and undergirded the secular religion that is anti-communism. Nevertheless, in the 20th century, the rise of the class project at home and abroad provided tremendous momentum which led directly to the retreat of apartheid at home and abroad. However, the class project has suffered debilitating blows in recent years, leading to the recrudescence of religious and racial conflict as manifested in Baghdad and Baltimore of late. Since the U.S. left does not seem to be able to make this simple diagnosis, it's hard to believe they will be able to come up with an adequate prescription hence the need for an intensified global solidarity to rescue this nation and this small planet from our weaknesses. Point number 2, the U.S. war in Indochina was the biggest fiasco in the history of U.S. foreign policy, though admittedly it has plenty of competition from the 2000 invasion of Iraq, which has given rise to ISIS, or the 1978 intervention in Afghanistan, which gave rise to the ascendancy of al-Qaeda. The war in Indochina was launched on the premise that it was a war against communism, that if one did not stop the Reds in Asia, there would be following dominoes, leading to a war against Reds on the beaches of Southern California. However, 4 odd decades ago, President Nixon worked out an entente with China that eroded the premise of the domino theory. But rather than pulling out of Indochina, the U.S. escalated this war until finally expelled on April 30th, 1975. Then a deal was worked out, leading to China waging war in Vietnam in 1979, with the payoff being massive direct foreign investment into this most populous of nations, creating a juggernaut which by some measures has surpassed the United States as having the most substantial economy on this small planet, with consequences too gargantuan to contemplate presently. Point number 3, finally. Oh, actually, this is less than 8 minutes. In light of the inability of the U.S. left to restrain the warmongers, as examples of Iraq, Afghanistan, and possibly Iran, if the Israel lobby prevails, suggest, the U.S. left must acknowledge the lessons of history and recognize that when substantial change has arrived on these shores, be it the fall of slavery or the retreat of Jim Crow, it has required a global coalition. Thus, the U.S. left should take advantage of the convening of the United Nations General Assembly annually in September, and thus from this point forward, convene a global coalition of peace forces at the same time, but given the premium on hotel space in Manhattan during the General Assembly, convene in the corridor stretching from New Brunswick to Newark, the latter city now led by one of our allies, Mayor Ras Baraka. Finally, a former US president, who actually visited this building, as I understand, once announced that we cannot escape history. This remains true today. We cannot escape the fact that this nation began as a slaveholders' republic, then continued as an apartheid regime. If we are to escape the new age of drone warfare and cyber warfare fought by robot soldiers, we of the US must first learn the bitter lessons of history, then reach out across the oceans and seas. Thank you.
Comments that Staughton Lynd made last night. He was the only person all evening who used the word union, and he talked about anti-communism, and I want to take off on that. And the dismissal, as he said, of the white working class during the anti-Vietnam efforts. And there's a good reason why the white working class, and particularly the organized white working class, the labor movement, was dismissed during that war. There was very little anti-war activity within the official labor movement itself. There's a reason for that. The war was about anti-communism, fundamentally. Anti-communism was the main weapon used by the right and the corporations in this country after World War II to destroy the American labor movement. Those of you who aren't in unions may not know it. The Taft-Hartley Act, which was passed in 1947, had in it clauses, legal requirements, that union leaders sign affidavits that they were not communists. And if they refused to sign it, their union was removed from having legal protections and could be raided and destroyed in various ways, and many unions were destroyed, including, for example, the electrical workers union. They were destroyed. It was the weapon of anti-communism which was used to do that. The legacy of that continued, obviously, up until at least the 90s. And during Vietnam, that's only 20 years after Taft-Hartley, there was, in the leadership of the American labor movement generally, a very anti-communist attitude. And George Meany led the labor movement, and there was very little organized activity against the war. The overwhelming image I think that people still may have today is of the events in New York in 1970. May 5th, 1970, the some building trades guys beat up anti-war protesters. A couple of weeks later, there was a big demonstration of building trades people for the war. It turned out, of course, that they were all apprentices and all paid for by the day by the corporations and the building trades establishment. But those were the lasting images of the labor movement during the war. There was some activity. My own union, 1199, was the first one. They sent a telegram to Johnson in 1965. In November of 1967, the Labor Assembly for Peace was formed in St. Louis. The auto workers, District 65, 1199, some of the AFSCME locals in New York, and some Teamsters in St. Louis formed Labor Assembly for Peace. And as the years went on, many individuals in the labor movement became very active in the anti-war movement. And into the 70s, some unions finally came out. But there was very little anti-war activity during Vietnam. We are in, and this is a message that I guess I bring to this discussion about coalition building, we're in a very different situation today. That I think when we think about the coalitions that we need to build, anti-military peace coalitions, it would be a terrible mistake to think only about what happened during Vietnam. The situation in the world and the situation in unions has changed radically since then. And I'll tell you the story about U.S. labor against the war. We started U.S. labor against the war in the fall of 2002 as it was clear Bush was going to invade Iraq no matter what. And we were tired of the labor movement being on the wrong side. We were able to do that because anti-communism had pretty much run its course in many ways, still existed in the labor movement. The Cold War was over. There were many leaders and activists in unions who came out of the anti-war movement and who understood what that meant. And generally, we had learned that our government can lie to us. Well, we had nothing more gross than the Bush lies about WMD and everything else, right-wing Republican president. So the possibilities were there to organize the labor movement against the war. And we formed U.S. Labor Against the War, as I said, in the fall of 2002. And we still have today over 160 unions in labor against the war. Unions means not you being a member of some local sending your name in. It means those unions have voted to join labor against war and pay dues and sustain it.
As organizations.
As organizations. We also have a long list of individual union activists from around the country who pay and individually belong to labor against war, but we have over 160. That includes national and international unions. It includes large state federations, dozens of central labor councils, large unions, small local unions all over the country have sustained with their dues money labor against war for these many years. I have to say I want to introduce two of our coordinators who are here from Labor Against War, Gene Raskin and John Braxton, who did a long time in prison around Vietnam. And we've been involved in many, many activities, including bringing Iraqi trade unionists to this country and doing tours around the country. At the 2005 AFL-CIO convention, Labor Against War introduced a resolution saying out of Iraq now. It passed. We thought there would be a huge debate from some of the very conservative unions. On the floor of that AFL-CIO convention, no one stood up to oppose a resolution by the official labor movement taking on an issue of war and peace and taking on the government. Think of how much of a change that was, and we accomplished that. So I guess the message I bring here today is if we're thinking about building broader coalitions, we have to think beyond the experience we all had during Vietnam. The organized light working class is in a very different situation today than it was at that time. And let me go further and lay out what we in Labor Against War have put out there. We've worked with basically every peace, anti-war, military budget organization that we can think of in the last 12 years. And we think that the main task facing all of us, and I think it's one of the main subtext that I hear in all the conversations the last 2 days here is we have to figure out how each of us can get out of our silos. There are a lot of people doing great work on these issues and come together to create a movement, not just a project or a success here and there, but put this all together. And we think that we will engage in that discussion with everyone. We think there are some elements that have to be there. Obviously, it has to be based around demilitarizing foreign policy and cutting the obscene 57% of discretionary funding radically. It has to be based around developing a sustainable economy. I'll come back to this in a minute. And those two issues have to involve just transition. That in our thinking about it, we cannot ask working people and working class communities to pay the price for the transition into both a non-military economy and a sustainable economy. So those two things. Obviously, the whole range of issues we've all worked on, the budgetary issues, the priorities issues, has to be centered to that coalition. And then the fourth thing I would add is we have to take on the ideological struggle as part of this. Now, I don't know how many of you read Naomi Klein's book. How many of you read Naomi Klein's book? Okay, if you haven't, on your way home, buy it, read it, and you'll see why I say it's mandatory reading, and you'll buy 10 more and give it to 10 more people. The book is about, obviously, climate scorching from last night, right? But her thesis is that capitalism is in contradiction to the life of the planet and humanity. And that's why there is great hope for bringing many movements together around the issue of sustainable economies. Because the only way we can fix this problem of scorching is by addressing so many issues. And at base of it is the need of capitalism to continue to exploit carbon. And we have to understand that. So I think we have to, also as part of this coalition, take on the ideological struggle. I have great trouble with this myself, I have to tell you. It is our form of capitalism. It's a horrible word, neoliberalism. That's what it is. But we have to find a way to explain to people as part of it that that's the source of the problem, because that's what it all comes back to. So that's what we've done, and we would like nothing more than to engage everyone here in building that grand coalition around demilitarization and racial justice and an economy that works for all.